Hey YouTube, welcome back to the Crazy Troll Nation of YouTube. My name is Dion. The crazy because we just do weird stuff here. Actually, it's because I'm weird. Yeah, I'm different. And I know I'm not for everybody, so I appreciate you for being here, for accepting my trollness for who I am. And the troll part, speaking of my trollness, is not caring too much about the beauty community standards. Try not to feel like you need to use a certain brand, a certain tool, or a certain technique. Use whatever you want to use, however you want to use it, because you need to be satisfied with your makeup. Beneath all of that, though, here at the Crazy Troll Nation, we are about self-acceptance and self-love, embracing our natural features, enhancing them if you want to, when you want to, but never feeling like you have to. Love yourself for who you are and for how you look, even without face paint on. That is the concept of the Crazy Troll Nation. I do use foul language sometimes in my videos because I do use foul language sometimes in real life. So what you see is really what you get. And honestly, you probably get the more fun side because I'm not so serious, because usually when I'm working, either volunteering or, doing therapy with clients, like, that is intense type stuff, and it's work, where this is fun. So thank you for being here. You can tell from the title what we're doing. I wanted to talk to you about how to create a custom palette. I used to never even think about creating palettes. I see a palette I like, that's what I'm getting. Even if there's a few shades I don't like, I'll do something with them. It is important for me to enjoy an entire palette. And I am aware, and I do acknowledge, and I do understand that some people will purchase a palette knowing they're not going to use every shade, knowing they're not going to like every shade. And it's worth it sometimes to just get a palette, if it's a 15 pan, knowing you're not going to use 2 shades because you're still using the majority of the palette. So I do understand that. And so I'm not knocking it. If you see a palette and you're like, I would never use that shade in that one, if it's still worth it to you, break down the cost, then go ahead and still get that palette. If you want to build your own palette, but you're not sure what to do. And I see people, they have a lot of single eyeshadows, and they'll just look at them, pull out this one, pull out that one, pull out this one, pull out that one, and they do a look. I am not good at that. I still need to see things in a palette because I know that those are the shades that's going to go together. And I have said numerous times, I do believe I have issues sometimes with color perception. A color may look one way, but then when I apply it, it looks different. And so that may change what the look is going to look like according to how I envisioned it, because I'm thinking this will look like this, and I'm looking at the palette, planning out what's going to go where, and then when I start applying the shades, it's like, that don't look right. And then I'm like, well, let's just keep going to make it work. And so keep that in mind too. So that's why it's hard for me to just pick different shades. So what I've learned is when I see a palette and I'm not able to buy it, I'm really trying to pay attention to what the shades look like to me, and that's what I will build a palette off of. The first time that I remember building a palette was based off of the Natasha Denona Metropolis palette. This palette was polarizing. Some people really liked it, some people didn't, and the issue was, it was a couple issues. All of these shades are not original to this palette. This one I pulled out, it was a chroma crystal. I hated it. I think these two are not original to this palette. Everything else is. And so aside from these two, which I just said they can look similar because I can use them for transition, and I use transition shades in almost every look. But one of the complaints with this palette was it was too many repeat shades. All of these are original to the palette, and when you look at them, these 3 look the same. When you look at this palette, these 2 look similar. When you look at it, this one looks similar to that one, though for me, when I apply them, they do show up different. And so the main complaint was there's a lot of repeat shades in this palette, and this was a $129 palette. Her website does have sales often. This has been out of stock for a long time because I've been checking for it and checking for it on sale. And the other reason some people didn't like it is they don't like her creamy matte and her cream to powder formula. I love her creamy matte and her cream to powder formula. And it didn't bother me to have similar shades because these are transition shades for me, or to buff out or to blend out lower lash line. And so I did not have a problem with that. But for $129, this is a 28 pan palette, and they are the smaller pans. But for the price, people were like, there should not be repeat shades. And I don't like the cream to powder formula, the creamy matte formula. Again, I do. These are things that people were saying. And I agree there are some repeat shades. But because they were shades that I would always use in almost every look, it didn't bother me. And so this disappeared on the website for a very long time. And I'm like, oh my gosh. This technically expired, according to my label on the back, September 2022. And I did use it just to see had it turned. And at the time when I used it, it had not. But I know it's just a matter of time. And I think it's whatever makes the cream to powder and creamy mattes creamy, that's what turns. Like her regular matte shades to me and her metallics and shimmers, I don't have an issue with, but it's the matte ones. And so I do think it's whatever makes it creamy. And so I've been holding on to it because just to remind me of what I want and hoping it goes on sale and comes back. And it did come back, but it was not on sale. And I'm like, I'm not buying this, not on sale. So what I did was I said, let me, go to the little MAC store, and I had points and stuff, and I was able to redeem for shadows. And so I created a palette. And what I did was I took this with me to the MAC store. And I said to her, I would like to build a palette off of some of these shades. And so she's really just looking at it. They are very knowledgeable at MAC. You can say something and they'll just go right to it. If you describe a shadow and they're like, is it this one? And I'm just like, how do y'all know like what everything is? So I took this with me and I laid it on the counter. And when I go, it's never busy. And and so they'll spend like 15 to 30 minutes with me on stuff. And so we were looking at the different shades in here. And because I didn't want to create a palette with a lot of repeats, it was like, okay, a deep blue, maybe a lighter shade. Of course, something similar to these as transition, maybe a shade like this one, and definitely some, oops, touched it by mistake, and definitely some greens, and this shade. So really that's kind of what you have. You have like a copper, you have some green grunges, you have a couple deep shades, you have a red, and then the rest are tans and neutral beiges. So that's really what you have. And so what I created was this 9-pan MAC palette. And so what I'm saying is, in a long roundabout way, is pick out shades and try to dupe them to create your palette. So look at these two. This, what shade is that? This is Illuminati. It's a black, this is shimmer. And I got that to replace these two. Even though these do show up like a deep green and a deep blue, they didn't quite have that at the MAC store. And so, but if you look at it, you have the pop of red, you have the transition shades, meaning the neutral beiges, tan shades. You have a couple greens. You have this shimmer blue that's in the middle. So this, and you have this brown right here, which isn't necessarily a Metropolis, but I can use it to deepen up other looks. And so the basis for Metropolis 28-pan palette is in this 9-pan palette, the main shades. And so that's how you can build a palette. If you already have one, take it in the MAC store with you, or any other store where they sell single shadows, or just really look at a palette online and then, open up another window in a different browser and look at single shadows from a website that sells single shadows and just try to piece it together. Because I know when I pick up this palette, I'm going to be able to do a lot of looks with it because I was able to do a lot of looks with this one. And so even though this is single shadows, it's in a palette that I know these shades, what was I going to say? I don't know. These shades will work to do multiple looks. And so that's how I learned how to put together a palette, because again, I was just like, I don't know what to do. And because stuff be looking different, I was just like, I don't know. I said, I'm gonna take it with me. And that's what I did. And that's how I built this one. Another easy way, if you're into Lethal Cosmetics, their website, when you click on the shadow, it gives you the description, it shows you the shadow in the pan, and it shows you a swatch. And when I built my lethal palettes, I was on the website up to an hour, just like looking through the descriptions and figuring out what will go with what. When I did create my palette, what was helpful to me when Metamorphosis and Evergreen came out, I didn't want an all green palette, even though a few of my palettes from Lethal do look mostly green. I didn't want the Evergreen palette, and I didn't want the Metamorphosis because I tend to like the darker based multi-chromes and dual chromes. And in those palettes, there's a lot of the lighter base, lavender base, silver base, pink base, translucent base, and those are the shades that I don't lean toward. And so I didn't want to get those palettes because of that, because there were shades in both of them. I'm thinking, I don't want those shades. And because the shades in those palettes you can also purchase as singles. I love Lethal's website. I looked at the palette because it tells you what shade is what. And so I wrote down which shades I wanted, and then I went to the Create Your Palette, and those are the shades that I put in to create the palette. So that's how I created my Lethal palettes, is by looking at the pre-made palettes, the shades in there, the ones that I liked, the ones that I wanted, and purchased the singles and created a palette. And so that's a tool that is really helpful for me. And I don't know if other websites do that, where they have a pre-made palette and it'll tell you what the shades are, and they sell those shades as singles. I'm not big with indie brands, and so I don't know. If you do know that there are other websites like that, they sell pre-made palettes and they also sell the shades individually, please leave that down below in the comments, and so that we can help each other out. I do know a lot of people really enjoy indie brands and they would prefer just to buy single shadows. And so if you're wanting to build a palette from single shadows, but you're overwhelmed, because it is overwhelming, even on the Lethal website it was overwhelming, this will help you. So let's help each other out in the comments with that. And even for the new palette from Lethal, it's a lot of light shades, and I'm like, I'm not getting that. It's like 2 shades I want from that palette. So I'm waiting, and I do have credit from the brush situation, and so I'm just waiting. So these are just 2 ways you can build a palette. If you have one physically that's expiring, take it to a store that sells singles, pick out the shades you want the most, put that palette together. Or if there's a website that sells pre-made and has those shadows as individual singles, pick out the shades you want and create your own palette. So those are 2 easy ways. If you have a good eye for color and a good eye for matching shades and a good eye for what will go with what, which I don't, but if you have that skill, any website that sells singles you can go to and build a palette. Nomad, a few of their palettes, they do sell singles. And so if you just want certain shades, you can just pick certain shades. And I think that is very useful, because sometimes you don't want a whole palette. Sometimes you do just want a few shades from that palette. And so that's the way too. If you don't want the whole palette and they sell singles, just pick out the ones you want and build your own palette, which is sort of what I was saying with the Lethal situation with their pre-made palettes. And so that'll be it for this video. Really short. It's been on my mind to say because it was something I struggled with. And when I see people just pulling from their collection, I'm like, how do they do that? So I'm like, let me just make my own. And so I'm hoping this information on how to build your own palette is helpful to you if you're feeling overwhelmed, or if it intimidates you to just look at a website with like 100 single shadows and it's just like, what? I don't know what to do. And so that's kind of how I felt. And so I'm thinking somebody else has got to have felt that way too at some point, right? Please say yes. Right? Please say yes. So that'll be it for this video. Let me know what you think down below. Let me know if you have an extensive single shadow collection. Let me know how you go about building your own palette for a look to do that day, and then you put all the shadows back, and then the next day you're pulling out other shadows. If you have that skill, let us know. Like, is it something you either have or you don't have the eye to do? Was there a technique or something that you learned to how to put different single shadows together to do a look. And if you have struggled with creating your own palettes, how did you overcome that? The ways I described are the ways that I've learned to overcome that and to create a palette from singles. And so let's just discuss below, and feel free to comment to each other. You know, it's a discussion, and let's just help each other out so we can all have the shadows that we want and not purchasing shadows that we don't. Thank you for being here. As always, self-acceptance, self-love. That is the Crazy Troll Nation way. Thank you for being here, and you will see me soon.